She raised her glass over the long backyard table, the string lights just flickering on above us, and she said, "To my mother, who counts every penny." 40, people laughed. I was holding the cake knife. My name is Ruth Calloway. I am 68 years old, and for 34 years I kept the books for other people's businesses. I set the knife down. I did not set it down hard. But while the laughter was still going, while my son-in-law Brett refilled his glass and grinned at his own wife's wit, I already knew the worst was still coming, and that it had nothing to do with a toast. It had to do with a folder in my hall closet, and a signature they'd both forgotten they made. Welcome back to decades of patience, where the woman they underestimate is the one who has been holding every card the whole time. If a chapter of this has ever sounded like your own life, if someone has ever spent your carefulness and then called you cheap for having it, then you are exactly who I made this for. Stay with me. That folder comes out before we're done, and when it does, one phone call ends everything they thought they owned. "Who'd like a corner piece?" I said. And I cut the cake. Let me tell you what was actually inside that joke, because the joke and the disaster were the same fact, finally meeting in public. The little nest egg Renata was toasting was, at that moment, no longer entirely mine. $156,000 of it had left my retirement account 2 years before. It had gone into the business that paid for the lights strung over our heads, the catered table, the leased SUV in the driveway, and the christening gown my granddaughter wore that afternoon. Renata was laughing at my frugality while standing inside a party my frugality had bought. She just didn't know it was a loan she was standing inside. She thought it was a gift. She thought wrong, and the proof of how wrong was sitting in a folder 11 miles away, notarized, recorded, and dated. I smiled and handed out cake on paper plates and let them laugh. I have always been very good at letting things go in the moment and remembering them with perfect clarity later. It is, in fact, the only real skill I have. Everything else I ever did for a living was just that skill, applied to numbers. I want you to hold on to something before I go a single step further, because the rest of this story turns on it. People assume an old woman signs what she is handed. People assumed it about me my whole life. That assumption is the hinge. Everything that happened, the toast, the laughter, the disaster, and the quiet thing I did 3 weeks later that could not be taken back. All of it hangs on the fact that I am a woman who reads the document before she signs it. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and I promised I wouldn't waste your time pretending I was helpless. So let me tell you what arrived 4 days after the party. An envelope from First Cascade Bank. It was not addressed to me. It was addressed to Calloway, Holloway, Apex Restoration LLC, forwarded to my home because my address was still the contact of record on file. And that detail alone, the fact that the bank had my address and not theirs, told me something had drifted that should never have been allowed to drift. I stood at my mailbox in the afternoon sun, and I turned that envelope over in my hands, and a cold, quiet feeling went down through me. The kind I used to get at 10 at night when a set of books wouldn't reconcile, and I already knew, before I found it, that someone had been lying. I almost set it aside for them. It would have been the polite thing. I am a woman who keeps her hands out of other people's business. I built a 34-year career on the discipline of touching only the numbers I was paid to touch. For about 4 seconds, on my own front step, I considered leaving it sealed and handing it to Renata. Then I opened it. Of course I opened it. My name was on the line above my daughter's. Inside was a notice of default. Apex Restoration, Brett's Water and Fire Damage Restoration Company, the one Renata had sworn on her unborn child's life would pay Mom back the second we're in the black, was 60 days behind on a working capital loan of $220,000. And there, photocopied into the notice in the bank's tidy reproduction, was the signature page. 3 signatures: Brett Holloway, Renata Holloway, and Ruth M. Calloway, guarantor. I went inside and I sat down at my own kitchen table with that notice. And I am going to tell you exactly what I felt. Because if I lie to you here, the rest of this won't mean anything. It was not panic. I have read 1,000 default notices in my life from the safe side of the desk. I know what they are and what they are not. What I felt was a slow, cold settling, like silt going to the bottom of a glass, because in a single page I understood 3 things at once. I understood that they were drowning. I understood that they had not told me, that they had laughed at my carefulness over cake while a bank was already preparing to take everything. And I understood, with the clarity that 34 years of other people's books had trained into me, that the toast at the party and the notice in my hand were not 2 separate things. They were the same fact. My carefulness had built the floor they were standing on, and that same week they had laughed at the woman who built it, never feeling it smolder beneath them. They thought I was the small, careful woman they had borrowed from and need never repay. I was the guarantor on the loan that was about to bury them, and I was something else, too. Something they had not thought about in 2 years, but I'll come to that. The card stays in the folder a little longer. You'll know exactly when it comes out because the room goes quiet when it does. Now, I have to back up just far enough to tell you how my name got onto that line. Not 1 sentence further than I need, because the how is the whole card, and I've been promising you the card. It was the spring of 2024. Renata called me on a Tuesday. She always called on Tuesdays the way you schedule a chore, and she was crying. The real kind, not the kind she used to use on her father. Brett's business was good, she said. Genuinely good. The work was there, the phone rang all day. But they'd grown faster than the cash, and they needed a bridge. A real loan from a real bank to carry payroll and the trucks through the slow stretch before the insurance reimbursements came in. First, Cascade had approved them in principle, but the bank wanted more security than a 2-year-old company, and a couple in their 30s could offer on their own. The bank wanted a guarantor, someone with assets and a clean credit history. They wanted me. I did not say yes on the phone. I never say yes on the phone. That one habit has saved me more money than any other I own. I said, bring me everything, every statement, the loan terms, the operating agreement, all of it. Give me the weekend. And Renata, who has spent her whole life finding my carefulness exhausting, said, Mom, we don't have a weekend, the rate's locked through Friday. And I said, then you have until Thursday night. And if it isn't all on my table by then, the answer is no. She brought it Thursday at 6. I read every page. That is what I do. And here is what I found. The part that matters. The part they would spend the next 2 years forgetting I was capable of. The deal the bank had handed them, and the deal I was willing to sign were not the same deal. Now let me ask you something, and I mean it, because it changes how the rest of this lands. Have you ever helped someone you love with money? Real money? The money that was supposed to be your old age, and watched them turn it from a kindness into an entitlement? Watched thank you become of course, become she's got it sitting around anyway? If you have, tell me in the comments. I'd like to know I'm not the only one who learned that the people who borrow the most are often the ones who feel they owe the least. And subscribe, because what I did at that kitchen table on a Thursday night in 2024 is the only reason I'm telling you this from a position of strength, instead of a position of grief. Here is what I did. I sat at my kitchen table with Brett's loan package and a yellow legal pad, the same kind I'd used for 34 years, and I did not sign what the bank had drafted. I told Renata and Brett that I would guarantee the loan, that I would put my name and my assets behind their company. But I would do it on 3 conditions, and all 3 would be in writing, recorded, and notarized, or there would be no signature at all. Brett didn't like it. I remember exactly the way his jaw worked when he heard the word conditions. He was a big, handsome man who had thus always treated me as a charming little obstacle between him and the things he wanted, and being told that his mother-in-law required terms was, I could see, a small humiliation he intended to forget the moment the money cleared. But they needed the guarantor, and the guarantor was me. So they sat at my table, and they listened. Let me put you in that kitchen, because I want you to see the night they signed, and I want you to see what they didn't. It was a Thursday in April, a little after 6. I had the overhead light off and the lamp on the counter on, the way I like it, and I had made coffee nobody drank. There were 4 chairs at my table. Brett took one. Renata took one. Diane, I'd called my attorney and asked her to come, because I do not conduct money at my own table without counsel, not even with my own daughter, took the 3rd. And the 4th chair, the one at the head, by the window, I left empty. That was Walter's chair. My husband sat in that chair for 29 years and balanced our checkbook in it on the 1st of every month, and he has been gone 11 years, and I still do not let anyone sit in it when money is on the table. Renata knows why. Brett thought it was just an empty chair. That, too, is the whole story in miniature. The people who knew what the empty things meant, and the man who only saw the things that were full. I had Brett's loan package in a folder and my yellow legal pad beside it, and I read the bank's draft out loud, line by line, the way Walter and I used to read anything that mattered, out loud to each other, so that nothing could hide in the silence of a page. "Stop," I said, 3 lines in. "This is an unconditional personal guarantee. Unlimited. It says here that on default, the bank can pursue me personally, for the full balance, the fees, and their collection costs, with no cap and no release. Brett, do you know what that means?" Brett shrugged, the shrug of a man who has never once read the 2nd page of anything. "It means it's standard, Ruth. It's what they all want. Nobody actually reads it." "I read it," I said. "I read it for 34 years, for other people, and I never once let one of them sign this. Renata, hand me the pad." And here, when my voice should have risen, it dropped. I want you to notice that, because it is the brand of everything I am. When the stakes go up, I go quiet. Anger makes a person bigger and easier to argue with. Quiet makes them smaller and impossible to find the edges of. I lowered my voice, and I picked up my pen, and I said, "We're not signing theirs. We're signing mine. 3 conditions, in writing, recorded and notarized. Or there is no money, and you can go back to First Cascade on your own and see how far its 2-year-old company gets without me." Renata sighed, the long, theatrical sigh she has used on me since she was 14. "Mom, it's a bank. You can't just rewrite a bank." "You'd be surprised," Diane said, mild as milk, "what Ruth can rewrite. First condition." The $156,000 they also wanted. Separately, on top of the bank loan, straight out of the cash in my self-directed retirement account, for equipment the bank wouldn't finance. That was not a gift, and it was not family money. It was a loan. From me to Apex Restoration LLC, documented with a promissory note, with a real interest rate, with a payment schedule, and recorded as a secured claim against the company's equipment and receivables. Renata was insulted. She said, and I will never forget it, "Mom, you're treating us like clients." And I said, "No. I'm treating you like a business because that's what you're asking me to fund. I treat clients better than this. I'd never let a client sign what that bank wants you to sign." She didn't understand what I meant. She thought I was being difficult. I was being kind, in the only language money speaks, and she heard it as an insult. And that small mishearing is the one they would keep repeating, in larger and larger ways, until it cost them everything. 2nd condition. In exchange for the note and the guarantee, for putting my retirement and my name on the line, I would receive a 40% membership interest in Apex Restoration LLC, documented in the operating agreement, with a seat at the table and the right to inspect the books on demand. Not a silent gift. An ownership stake. Brett bristled as this one most of all. It was his company, his name on the trucks. But Renata, who wanted the money more than Brett wanted the pride, talked him into it in the kitchen while I pretended not to hear, and they came back and agreed. Because to them, In 2024, it was abstract. 40% of a struggling, cash-starved, 2-year-old company felt like 40% of nothing. They thought they were giving me paper that would never be worth anything. They were buying their future with paper they didn't believe in. Remember that. The paper they didn't believe in is the paper that ends this story. Third condition. My guarantee to the bank was capped, in writing, and it contained one clause that the loan officer at First Cascade actually complimented me on. A clause that said my personal guarantee could be released, replaced by the company's own assets, and my membership interest, once the loan had been current for 12 consecutive months. I wrote that clause myself on the yellow pad. Brett thought it protected him. It protected me. There's a difference, and the difference is the entire ending of this story. So remember the 12 months. Remember that they never came. And then there was the part nobody wanted me to fight for. The part that took 2 phone calls to the bank and very nearly killed the whole deal. And the part that, 2 years later, was the difference between me losing everything and me holding everything. So stay with me one more minute, because this is the dull clause that turns out to be the whole sword. When you lend a company money on a secured note, the question that matters more than the interest rate, more than anything, is one ugly little word: position. Who gets paid first? The bank had drafted their loan to take a first priority lien, a UCC-1, filed against all of the company's assets, equipment and receivables and everything else. Standard, senior to everyone. Which would have meant that my $156,000, secured against the same equipment and receivables, would sit behind the bank's $220 in line. Junior. If it ever came to collecting, the bank would empty the well first, and I would get whatever was left at the bottom, which on a failing company is usually nothing. I would not sign that. So I called the loan officer myself, the first time I spoke to Mr. Okafor, and I asked him for a carve-out. I asked the bank to subordinate its lien on the equipment and the receivables to my note, and to keep its first position only on the real property. The trucks and the money owed by customers would secure me first. The buildings would secure them first. He told me politely that the bank did not do that. I told him, just as politely, that then the bank did not have a guarantor, because without my carve-out there was no me. And without me there was no loan, and a 2-year-old restoration company with thin cash, and a managing member who couldn't file a claim was not getting $220,000 from First Cascade or anyone else on its own. Mr. Okafor, I said, I am the entire reason this loan exists. I'm not asking the bank to take a worse deal. I'm asking it to take a deal at all. He went away and came back 2 days later and gave me the carve-out, narrowed but real. My note senior on equipment and receivables, the bank senior on real property, both perfected, both recorded. He told me he'd never had a guarantor ask for that before. I told him most guarantors don't read the second page. That is the clause that made me the largest secured creditor on the very assets the bank would one day be circling. Brett never knew it existed. Renata signed it without reading it. And neither of them ever once asked the question that any competent person asks before signing anything this size. Where is our own lawyer? Diane was my lawyer, sitting right there at my table. I told them, I said it twice, go get your own counsel. Do not take legal advice from the person on the other side of the deal. Brett waved it off. Lawyers cost money, and the money was the whole problem. Renata said, Mom, you'd never let anything happen to us. They waived it. They signed papers drafted by my attorney, against my interest as much as theirs, with no one in the room looking out for them, but the woman they would spend 2 years calling cheap. Remember that they were offered the door and chose not to walk through it. It matters at the end. Now watch them sign. This is the moment the whole story rests on, and it took less than 90 seconds, and neither of them remembers it the way it happened. Diane had the documents ready by the following Thursday. The note, the amended operating agreement, the capped guarantee with my 12-month clause. A notary came to my kitchen, a tired woman named Paula with a stamp and an ink pad and a place to be. And I watched my daughter and my son-in-law sign the most important papers of their lives, the way most people sign a delivery slip. "Where do I sign?" Brett said. "Not what does it say. Where do I sign?" He had his phone in his other hand, and he was answering a text about a dehumidifier rental while he did it. And he wrote his name on the membership amendment. The page with the removal clause on it, the page that would one day cost him his own company, without his eyes ever traveling up to the paragraph above the signature line. "Brett," I said, "read it first." "Ruth, I trust you," he said, and he smiled. And he meant it as a compliment, and it was the single most expensive sentence he would ever say to me. I trust you. He did not trust me. He simply could not be bothered to read, and he had learned to call that trust because trust sounds like a virtue and laziness does not. Renata signed next. She did read, a little. She read the way you skim a contract you've already decided to agree to. Her eyes sliding down the left margin, catching on the dollar figure and nothing else. She came to the clause that gave me the right to inspect the books on demand, and she paused, and she looked up at me, and for just a second I thought she might actually ask what it was for. "Honestly, Mom," she said instead, "all this for family." And she signed. I signed last, slowly. I read every line, the way I read everything, even the lines I had written myself, because Walter taught me that the lines you wrote are the ones most likely to fool you. I signed in the empty chair's light. Paula stamped each page. The note was recorded, the amendment was filed, and $156,000 left the retirement account that Walter and I had built one careful deposit at a time, across 29 years, and went into Apex Restoration, LLC. I want you to hold one image as we go on. My daughter and my son-in-law, signing their names above clauses they never read, certain that the careful old woman was the one who didn't understand how the world worked. That image is the answer to everything that comes next. And then, for 2 years, nobody said the word "oh" to me again. That's how it always works, isn't it? The money goes in fast and loud, with tears and promises and a hand on your arm. And then it goes quiet. The first 6 months, Renata mentioned the repayment schedule herself, unprompted, almost proudly. "We sent the first note payment, Mom, right on time." The next 6 months, she stopped mentioning it, and when I asked, gently, once, she got a tightness around the mouth and said the business was reinvesting, and that the accountant said it was smarter to defer. The accountant. I had been a controller for 80 employees. And my own daughter was quoting me an accountant she'd hired to tell her what she wanted to hear. I let it go. I am very, very good at letting things go in the moment. I am even better at remembering them later, in order, with the dates. By the second year, the story had changed completely. The money I had lent them had become, in the family telling, money I'd simply had sitting around. The 40% stake I held had evaporated from everyone's memory the way an inconvenient fact does once people stop saying it out loud. And my carefulness, the carefulness that built the retirement account they dipped into, the carefulness that insisted on the note and the stake and the cap. My carefulness had been quietly recast as a personality flaw. A funny one, a toast-worthy one. Mom counts every penny. Now I want to be fair to my daughter, because the easy version of this, my daughter, the villain, is a lie, and I don't tell those. Renata is not a thief. Renata is a woman who married a man whose confidence outran his competence, and who decided, somewhere in the long strain of holding up a life that cost more than it earned, that the cheapest thing she could spend was her mother's dignity, because her mother would never charge her for it. She loved me. She loves me still. She loved me in the careless way of people who have always been able to draw on you, and have therefore never once stopped to learn what the account costs to keep open. That is a real kind of love. It is just not a kind you can retire on. And Brett, I have less patience for Brett, but I'll be fair to him too. Brett genuinely believed the business would come good, that the slow stretch would end. That one big contract would make all of it retroactively wise, and that when it did, paying back Ruth's money would be a rounding error he'd handle generously, with a nice dinner and a fuss and a card. He wasn't lying when he said they'd pay me back. He was doing the thing optimistic men do, which is mistake what they intend for what they've done. But the notice from First Cascade was not an intention. It was a fact in a bank's flat language, and it said the business was 60 days from the bank coming after the guarantor. And the guarantor, the small, careful woman who counts every penny, was me. So now you know what I held, and you know what they'd forgotten. Let me tell you what I did with the days between the notice and my decision, because a card is no good if you play it badly. And I had spent my whole working life watching people play good cards badly out of hurt and hurry. The first thing I did was nothing. For one full day, I did nothing at all, except read. The operating agreement, the note, the loan documents, the default notice. Side by side at my kitchen table, the way I'd read 1,000 sets of books, looking not for what I felt but for what was true. The frightened old woman reading was right there, and it was terrifying. I co-signed for my children. The business is failing. The bank can come for my house and my remaining retirement and everything I have left, because that is what a guarantee means. But I had not signed what the bank drafted. I had signed what I drafted. And what I drafted, 2 years earlier, on a yellow legal pad while my daughter sighed at my fussiness, contained the clause about the 12 months. It contained a 40% ownership stake that gave me rights inside the company that neither of them had thought about in 2 years, because the company had felt worthless. And it contained one more clause, one Brett never read, one I'll come to at the table, that turned the whole thing on its head. Because a business in default is not the same as a business worth nothing. And here is where my carefulness becomes the whole story. So stay with me. I knew something about Apex that Brett and Renata had stopped paying attention to. Because I am the kind of woman who keeps paying attention to things long after everyone else has decided they don't matter. 11 months before that default notice, back when Renata first stopped mentioning the repayments and started quoting her accountant, I had quietly exercised my inspection rights. I'm a 40% member. I'm entitled. I had sent Brett a short, polite letter requesting the books for review. He never answered. He ignored it the way he ignored anything that felt like homework. So let me take you to the Apex office. Because I went there myself, on a Tuesday afternoon in the spring, before the default, and what I found at the bottom of a printout is the reason this story has an ending I can live with. I knew Brett would be on a job site, a burst pipe in an office park out by the interstate. Renata had mentioned it, complaining, the way she complained about all his work without ever doing any of it. So I drove over in the middle of the afternoon and I walked into the little storefront office, past the magnetic sign on the door and the smell of damp carpet and machine oil that clings to a restoration company, and there was a young woman at the front desk. Her name tag said Kayla. She could not have been 23. "Hi, I said. I'm Ruth. Brett's mother-in-law, the one who's good with numbers." I smiled the smile that has gotten me into every room I have ever needed to be in. He asked me to take a look at a couple of the reports for him. "Could you print me the receivables aging and the equipment ledger? It'll save him a headache tonight." I had not, of course, been asked to do any such thing. But I am a 40% owner of that company with on-demand inspection rights, written into the operating agreement, so I was entitled to every page in that building, and Kayla didn't know about the 40%, and she didn't need to. She knew me as the harmless old woman with a hobby. That is the disguise I have worn my whole life, and it has never once failed me, because the people who built it for me are too comfortable in it to take it back. "Oh, sure," she said, already clicking. "He's terrible about reports. He hates the office part." She said it fondly, The way the whole family said everything about Brett's failures fondly, as though they were charming, as though somebody else would always quietly absorb the cost of them. The printer hummed. She handed me the warm pages. I sat in my car in the Apex lot, and I read the aging report the way I have read 10,000 of them, my eye going straight down the right-hand columns. Current, 30, 60, 90 plus, because that is where a company tells you the truth it won't say out loud. Most of it was ordinary. Slow but ordinary. And then my finger stopped at the very bottom of the 90 plus column, and the old controller's stillness came over me, the one that feels almost like cold. One line, one job. A commercial medical building, flooded, mitigated, rebuilt, signed off by the property manager. Status, complete. Amount, $290,000. An aging, 122 days, and climbing. Finished work. Real money. Just sitting there, I went back inside. Calm, no hurry, and I asked Kayla, lightly, this medical building. Big one. Has the final claim gone into the carrier yet? And she made a face and pulled up the file and said, Ugh, no. The completion certificate's still in Brett's inbox. He keeps saying he'll do it. He hates the paperwork part. She hates the paperwork part. He hates the paperwork part. The whole company was chorus of people who hated the part where the money actually came in. $290,000 of completed work, uncollected, because the man steering the company would not spend 1 hour filing one form. I thanked Kayla, and I told her not to mention it to Brett, because I didn't want to embarrass him with the report, and she promised she wouldn't, because to her I was a sweet old lady saving her boss some grief. I drove home and I did not say a word to anyone. I filed the printout in the folder in the hall closet, behind the note and the amendment, and I thought, someday, that is going to matter. I did not know how. I just knew that finished work that nobody had bothered to collect is the rarest, cleanest kind of money there is. It is already earned. It is already owed. It only wants a careful hand to go and get it. And careful, as my whole family kept reminding me, is the one thing I am. The worst day came in an envelope. The folder was already waiting for it. So let me say the thing plainly, because it is the spine of everything. Apex Restoration was not drowning because it was poor. Apex was drowning because the person steering it could not count, and had married a woman who'd been raised by a woman who counted beautifully, and had then spent 2 years toasting that woman for it, as though it were a defect. There was $250,000 of collectible money sitting inside the company that was about to be foreclosed on, and the only person connected to that company who knew how to go get it was the one they laughed at over cake. Stay with me here, because this is where the patience pays off, and I don't want you drifting. If you have ever sat on a piece of knowledge while the people who needed it laughed at you for having it, you know the particular stillness I'm describing. There is a strange peace in it. Tell me in the comments if you've felt it, and subscribe, because the phone call I made on the 5th day is the irreversible one, and I want you in the room for it. On the 2nd day, I made an appointment with my attorney. Her name is Diane Pruitt. She drew the original note and the operating agreement amendment back in 2024, which is to say she'd been holding my card with me for 2 years. And she was as ready as I was. I brought her the default notice. She read it once, set it down, looked at me over her glasses, and said the single most satisfying professional sentence I have heard since I retired. "Ruth," she said, "they have no idea what you can do to them, do they?" "No, Diane," I said. "They think I count pennies." She did not quite smile, but close. "Well," she said, "let's count some." Here is what Diane confirmed, what I already knew, but needed certified because I do not act on what I feel, I act on what is documented. As a 40% member with on-demand inspection rights and a recorded secured claim, I was not a frightened guarantor about to be steamrolled by a bank. I was the largest secured creditor and the second largest owner of a company that held $250,000 of collectible receivables and was failing for one reason only. the lack of a competent hand. My note, the one for my $156,000, the one Renata called treating us like clients, was secured against the company's equipment and receivables, and because of the carve-out I had fought Mr. Okafor, for in 2024, it sat senior to the bank on exactly those assets, which meant that if Apex couldn't pay, I had first claim on the receivables the bank was circling, including $250,000 of finished work, ahead of the bank on the trucks and the money owed, ahead of unsecured creditors, ahead of the owner's equity, ahead of Brett's pride, and then there was the clause Brett never read. Buried in the operating agreement amendment, the one he'd skimmed and signed because Renata already had, was a provision that gave the membership the right, on a default of the company's obligations, to remove the managing member by majority interest and appoint a new one. 40% is not a majority, I know that, but Renata held 30%, Brett held 30%, and there is a particular arithmetic that a woman who has counted pennies her whole life understands instantly, and a man who has never balanced a checkbook does not. 40 plus 30 is 70, and 70 is a majority. The only open question was whether my daughter, with the bank at her door, would stand with her mother or her husband. And I want to be honest, that question kept me awake, not because I doubted the arithmetic, because I doubted what it would cost her to learn it. I did not want to take the company. I want to be honest about that too. I am 68 years old. I did not lend my retirement to my son-in-law in order to come out of it running a water damage restoration business at my age. But you cannot play a card you are afraid to play. And they needed to understand, all the way down, that the small, careful woman was holding the deed to their entire situation. So, I had Diane prepare 3 things. This is the surgical part, the part that fires once and cannot be undone. The first was a formal written demand on the company, under my secured note, for the $156,000 plus the accrued interest they'd stopped paying. A demand that, on a company already in default, perfected my first position claim against the receivables, including the uncollected medical building money. The second was a notice of a special meeting of the members of Apex Restoration LLC, called by a holder of 40% interest, exactly as the operating agreement had permitted, with one item on the agenda: the removal and replacement of the managing member. The third was a letter to the loan officer at First Cascade Bank, the one who had complimented my clause, invoking the cure provision and proposing that the loan be brought current and its guarantee restructured through an injection of collected capital and a change in management, contingent on the bank's forbearance. In plain words, I was offering to save the loan the bank was about to call, on the condition that the bank back the new management. Me. Diane drew all 3. I read all 3, line by line, the way I read everything, and on the morning of the 5th day, before I sent a single one of them, I picked up the phone and I made the call I told you was the irreversible one. I called First Cascade Bank, and I asked for the loan officer, a careful young man named Mr. Okafor. I told him who I was, the guarantor, the 40% member, the holder of the secured note. And then I told him I had $250,000 of collectible receivables sitting uncollected inside the company he was about to foreclose on. And I asked him one question. I asked whether the bank would rather pursue a 68-year-old guarantor over a few months' shortfall, in a process that would take a year, net them litigation costs, and earn them the kind of headline a community bank does not want, or whether they would rather see the loan brought current within 90 days by the only person connected to that company who actually knew how to collect a receivable. There was a pause on the line, a long one. I let it sit. I have closed more than one deal in my life simply by being more comfortable with silence than the man on the other end of it. "Mrs. Calloway," he said finally, "I have your file in front of me. I want to be careful here. You understand that as a guarantor, the bank's position is already quite strong." "It is," I said. You can pursue me, and you'd likely win, and it would take you a year, and your recovery would be the trucks at auction, and a lien on 2 houses, one of which is mine. You'd net pennies on the dollar after costs, and you'd have spent a year of an officer's time doing it. I read default notices for a living, Mr. Okafor, from the side of the desk you're sitting on. I'm not calling to plead. I'm calling to make you money. I heard him shift in his chair. Go on. There is a completed job on the company's books, I said. A commercial water loss claim at a medical building. $290,000. The work is done, signed off by the property manager, and uncollected. For the simple reason that the managing member never filed the completion certificate with the carrier. It has been sitting there 120 days because the man cannot be bothered to do paperwork. I can collect it. I've collected harder claims than that in my sleep. And what would you want from the bank? 90 days of forbearance, I said. No acceleration, no action against the guarantor. In exchange, I bring the loan fully current within that window, out of collected receivables. Not new debt. And I restructure the management of the company so this never happens again. I become the managing member. The same management that let $250,000 rot on the books is removed, and the management that knows how to collect it takes over. You don't foreclose on a defaulting borrower. You partner with the creditor who's about to make the borrower solvent. Another pause, but a different one. I could hear the arithmetic happening on his end now, the sound of a careful young man deciding I was not a problem but a solution. And you have the authority to change the management, he said. You're telling me you can do that. I'm a 40% member, I said, and there's a removal on default clause in the operating agreement. With the daughter's interest, the vote is 70%. I wrote the clause myself, Mr. Okafor. You'll find it sits right above the cure provision in my guarantee. I believe one of your colleagues complimented me on it at signing. There was a soft sound on the line. It might have been a laugh. That was me, he said. Then you already know I read the fine print. He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed. The way the owner's voice used to change, years ago, when I'd call him at 10 at night because the books wouldn't reconcile and I'd found out exactly why, and he'd stop being my boss for a second and just be a man relieved that somebody competent was holding the other end. Mrs. Calloway, he said, what exactly do you need from me to start? 90 days, in writing, signed today. The completion certificate will be filed by Friday. The bank would want it documented properly. Terms, milestones. It's already documented, I said. I had my attorney draft the forbearance proposal this morning. I can have it couriered to you by noon, with the secured note, the operating agreement, and the receivables report attached, so your committee can see the collateral for themselves. I heard him exhale, and then slowly, the sentence I had built the whole call to earn. I think, he said, we'd be very glad to work with you on this. That was the call. That was the moment the card came out of the hall closet, onto the table, where it could not go back in. Because once the bank knew what I knew, once the largest secured creditor and the holder of the swing vote had offered the lender a clean, profitable way out, the situation was no longer Brett's. It was no longer Renata's, and it had never, for a single day, been theirs the way they imagined it was. It was mine. It had been mine since the Thursday night in 2024 when I refused to sign what they handed me and signed what I wrote instead. I sent the 3 documents that afternoon. Certified mail to Brett and Renata, email and courier to Mr. Okafor. And then I made myself a cup of tea, and I waited for the phone to ring, and I did not gloat. Gloating is for people who weren't sure they'd win. Renata called at 7:40 that evening. I know, because I had been a bookkeeper for 34 years and I write the time on everything. She was not laughing about pennies now. She was crying. The real kind again. And underneath the crying was a sound I had not heard from my daughter since she was a child, and had broken something she knew was precious. It was fear. Mom, she said, Mom, what is this? Brett got there's a notice. A meeting. You're calling a meeting to remove him? You're foreclosing on us? On your own family? I'm not foreclosing on anyone, I said. The bank was about to. I called to stop it. By taking the company. By saving it, Renata. There's a difference. And you have never once in your life been willing to sit still long enough to learn what it is. She went quiet. And then she said the thing she'd been raised to say. The thing that had worked on her father for 40 years and had, in smaller ways, been working on me since the christening party and long before it. How could you do this to us? We're your family. I want to tell you exactly what I said back, because I had been turning it over for 5 days, and I said it without my voice rising even once. In the same level tone I'd used to ask who wanted a corner piece of cake. You stood up at my granddaughter's christening, I said, and you raised a glass, and you told 40 people that your mother counts every penny, and everyone laughed. And you were right, Renata. I do count every penny. I counted the 156,000 of them that left my retirement and went into Brett's trucks. I counted them again every single month the payment didn't come. I counted the 40% of a company you both decided to forget I owned. I counted the 12 months that never came current. And 4 days ago, I counted a notice of default with my name on it. A notice neither of you thought to warn me about, because you were too busy being embarrassed by the very habit that was keeping you afloat. She didn't say anything, so I finished it. So yes, I count every penny. It is the only reason there is anything left for any of us to fight over. If I had been the careless woman you toasted, the bank would already own the trucks, and your house, and mine, and you'd have nothing to be afraid of tonight except being poor. Instead, you're afraid of me. I'll take it. The silence on the line went on a long time, and then, very small, she said, What do you want? And there it was. Not how could you? Not we're your family. What do you want? The first honest question my daughter had asked me in 2 years. That was when I knew the card had landed all the way down. Because you do not ask a person what they want until you have finally understood that they are holding something you need. I want to come to the meeting, I said, both of you and Diane, and we'll do it properly, at a table, with the documents. I'm not removing Brett to humiliate him. I'm removing him as managing member because he cannot run the thing. And the proof is $250,000 of finished work he never collected, because the paperwork bored him. I'll bring the company current. I'll take it off the bank's books. I'll run it properly. And the note I hold gets paid first, out of the money I collect. The money that's already there. And then, if Brett wants it back someday, and if he's learned to do the part that isn't fun, we'll talk. But the careless way of doing this is over, Renata, tonight. It's over because I ended it, and it does not come back. And I need you to hear that before you decide whether you're standing with your mother, or with the version of your life that was about to take you all down with it. The meeting was the following Tuesday. Of course it was a Tuesday. We sat at Diane's conference table, a long oval of dark wood with a window behind it that looked out on the parking lot, 4 chairs, and a pitcher of water nobody touched. I want you to see the room, because where people sit tells you everything. Diane sat at the head in her own house, with a legal pad and a recorder she announced she was turning on. I sat to her right, with my stack of manila folders squared in front of me. Renata and Brett sat across from me, side by side, and the space between their 2 chairs had quietly widened to about a foot, which I noticed, because noticing is the only thing I have ever been good at. I had brought the documents in manila folders, 1 document to a folder, each labeled in my own hand, note, amendment, deft, receivables, bank, and stacked in the order I meant to walk them through it. Because order is half of clarity, and clarity is the whole of power in a room like that. I did not open them all at once. A banker does not pour the gold out on the floor. He counts it out 1 coin at a time and makes you watch each one land. Brett tried, once, near the start, to turn it back into a feeling instead of a fact. He spread his big hands on the table and he said, Ruth, come on, this is family. We don't need lawyers and votes and a recorder running. We can work this out between us the way families do. I opened the first folder. I slid the default notice across the table to him, the one with his own signature photocopied onto it. Brett, I said, we are using lawyers and votes precisely because it is family. A stranger, I'd have let the bank take. You, I'm trying to save. And saving you means that for once we do this the careful way, all the way through. On paper, so that no one can ever later decide it didn't happen the way it happened. He looked at that notice for a long moment, his own name in the bank's ink, and his hands came off the table. Because you cannot argue with a fact the way you can argue with an angry woman. That is why I was never going to be the angry woman. Anger can be answered. A document cannot. Then I opened the folders one at a time, and I laid each one in the center of the table where all three of them could read it, and I narrated each one in a voice that got quieter and shorter as I went. This is the thing I most want you to understand about how I did it. I did not build to a shout. I built to a whisper, the note. This is the 156,000. Recorded. Secured against the equipment and the receivables. First position. Renata called it treating you like clients. It is the only reason I'm not standing in line behind the bank tonight. The amendment. 40%. You gave it to me in 2024 because you thought it was worth nothing. Here is the clause above your signature, Brett. Removal of the managing member on default by majority interest. You signed it answering a text about a dehumidifier. The receivables report. I laid it down and I put one finger on the bottom line and I left it there. $290,000. The medical building. Finished. Signed off. Uncollected for 120 days, because the completion certificate is sitting in your inbox. The company isn't poor, Brett. It's just not being counted. The bank's letter. Signed this morning, Mr. Okafor. 90 days of forbearance. No action against any of us. Contingent on one thing. I did not say the one thing. I closed the last folder, and the room went quiet. The particular quiet that fills a space when everyone in it has finally understood who held the strong end of the rope the entire time. Renata was crying without sound. Brett was very still. The vote, Diane said gently, for the recorder, is to remove Brett Holloway as managing member of Apex Restoration LLCs and appoint Ruth Calloway in his place, effective immediately, pursuant to the operating agreement. Ruth Calloway votes her 40% in favor. Renata Holloway? I did not look at my daughter. I had learned not to help people across the hard part. The crossing is the point. I looked at the folders. Renata looked at her own hands on the table. Then she looked at the receivables report, at the single line my finger had rested on, and I watched the arithmetic move across my daughter's face, the way it used to when she was small, and I taught her to add. 40 and 30, 70, a majority, the difference between solvent and ruined. And she stopped being the woman who toasted me and became, for 1 second, the girl I raised. In favor, she said. 2 words. She did not look at Brett when she said them. Her 30% and my 40 became the 70 that ended one version of all our lives and began another. Diane noted it for the recorder, and then she said the thing a good witness says, the thing that made it more than a daughter siding with her mother. For the record, the documents support the action. The note is properly recorded and holds senior position on the receivables and equipment under the 2024 carve-out. The removal clause is valid and triggered by the default, and the bank's forbearance is conditioned on this change in management. This is not a family dispute. This is a creditor protecting collateral. I've reviewed every page. She had held my card with me for 2 years, and she set it down now like a woman closing a book she had read carefully. Brett did not shout. I'll give him that. I had braced for shouting, and he surprised me. He sat very still, the way a man sits when the thing he built has just been shown to him as the thing he was about to lose. He looked at the medical building line one more time, and then he said quietly, almost to himself, You could have just told me to file the paperwork. I did, Brett, I said, and here my voice was the shortest it had been all day, because the climax of a thing this size should not be loud. It should be small enough to fit in the cracks they left open. In March, and again in April. You told me you'd get to it. He had nothing to say to that. Because it was true, and the truth was sitting on the table in 5 open folders, where everyone could read it. That is the reckoning. I want to be precise about it, because I told you at the start it would be surgical and irreversible and quiet, and it was all 3. There was no screaming. There was a phone call to a bank, 3 certified letters, a vote at a conference table, and a signature, my daughter's, choosing arithmetic over loyalty to a sinking ship, which is exactly what I had raised her to be capable of, before she learned to be ashamed of it. The careless version of our family ended that Tuesday, and it did not come back. It could not because the documents that ended it were recorded, and recorded things do not unrecord themselves, no matter how carelessly anyone loved you. Now I'm going to tell you what happened after. And I'm going to tell you the true version, not the satisfying one, because I don't lie to make a story land harder. I collected the medical building money in 6 weeks. I want you to know it was not magic. It was work, the unglamorous kind Brett had been too proud to do. I called the insurer's claims line, and I was put on hold, and I called back. I learned the adjuster's name, then his supervisor's name. I filed the final completion certificate that Brett had let sit for 4 months. I sent the photographs and the signed work orders, indexed and tabbed. And when the adjuster tried to discount the claim for incomplete documentation, I sent him the documentation, every page, with a cover letter that quoted his own policy language back to him, paragraph and line, $286,000 after the haggling. It brought the loan current with room to spare. The bank released the portion of my personal guarantee it could release. Under the clause I'd written on a yellow pad in 2024, the one Brett had thought protected him. My secured note began to be paid, on schedule. First, out of money that had been sitting inside that company all along. Money the careful woman knew how to collect, and the confident man could not be bothered to. I told you I would give you the true ending, not the satisfying one. The true ending is this: it did not come back. There was no scene where Brett saw the light and thanked me. He was angry, and then he was quiet, and then he was simply a man who no longer ran the company that carried his name. I run the operations now. I chase the receivables and renegotiate the leases and harry the insurers, and Apex is current and profitable. Because the work was always there. It only ever needed someone who counted. Brett still works the jobs he was always good at. He does not sit at the head of anything. That was the consequence, and consequences are not supposed to be undone, and I did not undo it. Grace is not the same as reversal. I gave him no scene, no shouting, and no second key. What is true between Renata and me is smaller and slower, and I will not dress it up for you. What broke was never the money. It was the carelessness, and carelessness is harder to repair than a balance sheet, because it does not announce itself as broken. About a year after the meeting, she came by my house. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd read the default notice, and she was quiet for a long while, and then she said, "I think about the toast, the pennies thing. I think about it a lot." I didn't help her. I have learned not to help people across the hard part. The crossing is the point. "I made you into a joke," she said, "because it was easier than being grateful. And the whole time, you were the only reason any of it stood up." "Yes," I said. "I am not a woman who softens a true thing to spare someone the weight of it." I was. "How long did you know," she asked, "that it would come to this?" And I told her the truth, which was the only thing I ever should have spent on her. I didn't know it would come to this. I hoped it wouldn't. But I built it so that if it did, I would be holding the strong end. That's not a trick, Renata. That's just what careful is. Careful isn't counting pennies because you're afraid of running out. Careful is making sure that on the worst day, the day you can't see coming, the people you love are standing on something that holds. You spent 2 years laughing at the floor under your feet. I spent 34 years learning how to build one. She cried then. I did not. I let her sit with it because the sitting was the point, and I did not reach across the table to make it easier. After a while, I stood up and made tea, the way I would for anyone, and we drank it, and then she went home to the husband who no longer ran the company. It was not fixed. I am not sure it gets fixed. Some debts are paid in full, and some are only ever serviced, month after month, and I have made my peace with not knowing which kind this one is. What I know is that I did not pretend it was settled to spare either of us the weight of it still being owed. The folder is back in the hall closet. The note is being paid, on schedule, with interest, exactly as the document I wrote in 2024 said it would be, because I am the kind of woman who writes the document. The company is sound. My retirement is restored. And my granddaughter, who slept through the entire christening that started all of this, is 2 now, and she likes to sit on my lap and pull coins out of my purse and line them up on the kitchen table in long, careful rows. I let her. I'm teaching her to count. I want to leave you with the thing I keep coming back to. The thing I'd want her to know when she's old enough to be underestimated by people who love her carelessly. They told me I count every penny like it was a small life, but counting is not a small thing. Counting is how you keep the people you love from falling through a floor they don't even know is rotten. Every penny I ever counted, I counted for someone else's sake, including the ones who laughed. The careful ones are not the small ones. The careful ones are the only reason there is anything left for anyone else to be careless with. So if there is someone in your life spending your carefulness and calling you cheap for having it, you do not owe them your panic. You do not owe them a scene. Build the floor quietly. Write the document. Keep the folder. And on the day they finally need what you so patiently set aside, let the numbers do the talking. They always speak more clearly than you can, and they cannot be argued with. If you stayed with me all the way here, thank you, truly. Tell me in the comments, has someone ever spent your carefulness and then called you cheap for having it? Did you ever get to show them, quietly, exactly what your name was on? Write their first name down. I'd like to know I'm not the only one. Subscribe, and I'll tell you another, because there is always a folder in the closet. There is always a signature someone forgot they signed. I'm Ruth Calloway. I kept the books for 34 years. I counted every penny. That is the entire reason I still have a single one.